So I had to kind of make a new video because the last half of yesterday's video didn't record. But we left off talking about the red blood cells. So on the surface of a blood cell that is type A, they're going to have the A antigen. Okay, so that's going to be determined that it's going to be type A blood. Okay. If it has the B antigen on the surface of that red blood cell is going to be considered type B blood. Okay. If it has both the A and the B antigen, it will be considered type AB blood. And if it has no antigens on its surface, it's going to be considered type O. Okay. Now, in addition to having these antigens on the surface of the red blood cells, there's also going to be some antibodies in the blood plasma. Okay. And those antibodies are going to be built to whatever antigen you do not have in your blood. Okay. So for example, someone who is type A is going to have the A antigen, so they're going to have the anti-B antibody. Okay. So if they come into contact with any type B blood, their antibodies are going to start fighting off against that B blood, okay, to help kind of form an immune response against foreign substances. Okay. Now, if you're looking at type B blood, okay, that individual is going to have is going to have anti-A antibodies. Okay. So again, you're producing antibodies against whatever you do not have on your red blood cells. Okay. If you have the type AB blood, okay, you will have neither antibody, okay, which makes sense because you do not want to be producing anti-A antibodies because you have that on your own red blood cells, and you don't want to be producing anti-B anti-B antibodies because you also have that on your red blood cells, okay? So they're not going to be producing any antibodies against any of the antigens, okay? The flip side of it is if you're looking at type O blood, because it has no antigens on its red blood cell surface, it is going to have both the anti-A and the anti-B antibody. Okay? Again, producing antibodies against whatever it does not have. Okay? So like I said, those antibodies are going to be found within the blood plasma. Okay? Now, in addition to the A, B, and O blood types, there's also going to be a third one called the RH blood, or RH blood group, also kind of standing for the rhesus blood group. And so those who have the RH antigen are going to be considered positive or RH positive. Okay? And those who do not have the RH antigen are going to be considered RH negative. Okay, so this is what determines the positive and negative components of your blood type. Okay, so someone who is B positive will have the type B antigen as well as the RH antigen as well. Okay? Someone who is B negative would have the type B antigen along with no RH antigens on their red blood cells. Okay. That being said, there's also going to be some antibodies that are going to be produced in response to the RH antigen. Okay, that would be the anti-RH antibody. Okay, now looking at these two, which one do you think would be the one producing the anti-RH antibody? Okay, would it be the RH positive individuals or would it be the RH negative individuals? Okay. If you think it's the RH negative individuals, you'd be correct because again, you're producing antibodies against whatever you do not have. Okay. These guys do not have the RH antigen, so they're going to produce anti-RH antibodies. Okay. These guys who have the RH antigen will not be producing anti-RH antibodies because, again, they have that on their red blood cell surface. Okay. So individuals who, for example, have type B blood, I'll go ahead and just kind of draw this in red. So if we're looking at someone who's got type B blood, let's say this is their red blood cell surface, they're going to have the B antigen, okay, as well as the RH antigen. Okay. If you're looking at someone who is B positive, okay, and then you can use this to help you identify what types of antibodies these individuals will be producing. Okay. Okay, so kind of more on that in a second. Now. I'm going to clear that. Okay. All right, so all that's important because we need to be able to produce or perform transfusions for individuals who are losing too much blood, okay, or who have various types of other blood disorders. Okay? So a transfusion is where you actually deposit whole blood from one individual and you give it to, you inject it directly into the bloodstream of another individual. Okay, now the key here is that the donor's blood and the recipient's blood both need to be compatible with one another. Okay, that does not necessarily mean they need to match. Okay, they just need to be compatible with one another. Okay, and we'll give a few examples of that in a separate video. Okay, so they need to be compatible with one another in order for that transfusion to work properly and effectively. Okay. If the blood is incompatible, let's say you're giving someone, who's type A blood, who has the type A blood type, and you start giving them type B blood, what's going to happen is their body's going to start rejecting that blood. Okay. And so it's going to start rejecting that blood through a process called agglutination. And what's going to happen is the recipient is going to start producing antibodies against the donated blood, the donated red blood cells. Okay. When that happens, those antibodies are going to come in, they're going to start binding to those red blood cells and start cross-linking with one another, and they're going to basically end up start punching holes in the donated red blood cells. Okay. Now, when that happens, those red blood cells become very leaky and they start to rupture, and they release hemoglobin into the bloodstream. Okay. This is really bad because this can actually cause significant kidney disease. And so now you're in a situation where you were trying to help someone by giving them blood, but because you gave them the wrong blood, now you just added another layer to their condition by having them develop kidney disease from these freed hemoglobin. So it's very important to make sure that the blood that you are transfusing from one individual to another is compatible. Okay. Otherwise, they're going to end up rejecting that blood, and that can be a very dangerous situation for the recipient. Okay. So I'll go through in another video how you can identify what types of blood are able to be donated in order to have a compatible transfusion. Okay. And this will be important on the exam as well, okay, as well as on the practical. Okay, so question here. So which of the following is correct for an individual with AB positive blood type? Okay. So go ahead and kind of take a minute to read through there. If you want to pause the video, you can. Go ahead and pause it until you give yourself the time to figure out the right answer. All right, so the right answer for this one is E. Okay, has the A, B, and Rh antigens on the surface of their red blood cells. Okay. Why isn't it A? Okay. Why isn't A, B, and Rh antibodies? Well, remember, antibodies are what's found in the blood plasma, and this is what actually helps to fight off against foreign blood that is not compatible with the individual's blood type. Okay. So this is where we have similar words that mean different things. So antigens are found on the red blood cell to give it its identity. Okay. The antibodies are there to help produce an immune reaction when it's been exposed to the wrong type or an incompatible blood type. Okay, cool. All right, so this leads us to a condition called hemolytic disease of the newborn, or HDN. Okay. So in this particular condition, what happens is you might have a mother who is Rh negative. Okay. Now, because she's Rh negative, she's going to start producing antibodies against Rh positive things, right? Rh positive blood. If she happens to be pregnant and her baby has Rh positive blood, okay, and some of that blood leaks through the placenta and into her bloodstream, she's going to start producing antibodies against the baby's blood. Okay. So she's going to start producing anti-Rh antibodies, which are going to target her baby. Now, this is typically not severe for the first baby, but it usually will affect a second Rh baby from a second pregnancy. Okay. And so what happens here is because she's already produced these anti-Rh antibodies, okay, those antibodies are going to be very vigilant, and they're going to start to be very good at fighting off against any Rh blood or Rh positive blood that they've been exposed to. So if that blood ends up leaking from a second pregnancy, from a second Rh positive baby, she's going to start producing antibodies that are then going to target this particular baby. Okay. Again, usually doesn't affect the first one, but it usually will affect second and subsequent pregnancies with Rh positive babies. Okay. So you end up getting agglutination as well as hemolysis, or rupturing of the blood of the babies from the baby. Okay. There is a treatment for this. The treatment is using a drug called Rogam, I believe it is. And so what Rogam does is it essentially will tone down mom's immune response. And so instead of having these very vigilant antibodies, anti-Rh antibodies, it tones down her immune response so she doesn't produce them as much, and they're able to protect the baby in that way. Okay, so those are red blood cells. Okay, so the next type of cell we're going to be covering here are white blood cells. Okay. So white blood cells are also called leukocytes, and they're different from red blood cells in that they do have a nucleus and they do have other organelles, okay? But they do not contain any hemoglobin. Okay? So for that reason, white blood cells do not have any role in transporting oxygen. Okay? Their only role is when it comes to protecting the body from an immune perspective. Okay? So we've got two types or two classes of leukocytes here. The first type are the granular leukocytes. Okay? So this would be the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils. And if you look at these cells, they have these packets or these granules. Okay? They almost look kind of grainy here. Okay? These granules that contain enzymes and proteins that are able to destroy and degrade various types of pathogens. Okay? The second class are the agranular leukocytes, which do not contain any granules. Those would be the lymphocytes and the monocytes. And these two guys have other mechanisms of degrading different types of pathogens. So we're going to take a look at these guys in a little more detail as we go forward here. Okay. So the first one, before we get into that, to look at how white blood cells are going to operate, basically what's going to happen is these white blood cells are going to be just rolling along through the blood vessel. Okay. Once they eventually reach the blood vessel, once they reach a site of infection or a site of inflammation, they're actually going to leak out of these capillaries or out of these blood vessels here through the endothelial cells, okay, that make up those blood vessels. Okay. And as they leak out, they're eventually going to be able to find the site of the infection or inflammation and then be able to trigger phagocytosis or various other immune responses. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Once a leukocyte, once a white blood cell leaves the bloodstream, it can never go back. Okay. Unless it's a lymphocyte. Lymphocytes are the only white blood cells that are able to go back and forth. Okay. But if it's not a leukocyte, once it leaves, it can never re-enter the bloodstream. Okay. So it's going to have to stay within those interstitial spaces. Okay. And so the process of moving a white blood cell, or of a white blood cell exiting out of the capillary into the interstitial fluid or interstitial space is called emigration. Okay. Where it actually leaves the blood cell or leaves the blood vessel in order to fight off infection or inflammation. Okay, so one of the processes that's going to be used to help destroy various types of pathogens is what's called phagocytosis. And that's going to be where a white blood cell is going to be able to engulf and destroy some type of pathogen or bacteria or debris or whatever it may be. So the way that these white blood cells are going to be able to find that particular pathogen is through a process called chemotaxis. Okay? So for example, what's going to happen is when a pathogen enters the blood, it's going to start releasing some chemical signals. Okay? Those chemical signals are going to start attracting those white blood cells, and the white blood cells will kind of follow those chemical signals almost like breadcrumbs until they find the pathogen. Okay? Once they reach the pathogen, they're able to destroy it, and then you're good to go from there. So usually the first of so kind of going through the different types of white blood cells, the first one that we're going to be seeing here are the neutrophils. And the neutrophils are typically going to be the first responders to any type of pathogen. Okay. So they've got two different ways of destroying pathogens. The first one is using an enzyme called lysozyme. Okay. And so what lysozyme does is it will actually get released from the white blood cell, and it'll destroy any pathogen that has been ingested by that white blood cell. The other thing that it's going to be able to do is it's going to be able to release some defensins. Okay? So defensins are a type of molecule that will actually punch holes in the microbe's membrane. Okay? And as that happens, it eventually will cause the microbe to eventually just kind of rupture and destroy and end up getting destroyed. So, okay. Those are the neutrophils. Okay? So that's these guys over here. Okay? The second type of white blood cell are the eosinophils, which usually have a more reddish color. And their job is to phagocytize any parasites. Okay? So any worms that our body gets exposed to, the eosinophils are responsible for fighting off against those parasites. Okay? The third type of white blood cell are the basophils. Okay? And so basophils will release a number of different molecules like heparin, histamine, and serotonin. And what those molecules do is they will actually start to increase the immune response or the inflammatory responses. Okay? And so they're going to cause inflammation, and they're also going to be involved with mediating your allergic reactions as well. Okay. The fourth site are the monocytes, or the fourth cell are the monocytes here. And so what the monocytes will do is they're eventually going to enlarge and grow, and then they're going to differentiate to become macrophages. Okay, macrophages are able to phagocytize a whole lot more microbes than neutrophils are able to. Okay? And so they're able to destroy a wide variety of different things, different microbes, more so than what neutrophils are capable of, okay? As well as getting rid of some cellular debris as well. The last type of white blood cell are the lymphocytes. Okay? And so the lymphocytes usually are going to be able to move between the blood, the lymphatic vessels, and lymphoid tissues. Okay? And we've got three types of lymphocytes. Okay? The first ones are the B cells. Okay? And so the B cells, when they start to develop, will develop into what's called a plasma cell. Those plasma cells will start producing antibodies that will be able to destroy larger arrays of different types of bacteria and toxins. Okay? So be able to produce specific antibodies for specific bacteria and specific pathogens. Okay? The second type of lymphocyte are the T cells. Okay? And so T cells are able to destroy any infected body cell. Okay? Any cells that have been infected by a specific pathogen or any kind of tumor cells are going to be targeted by our T cells. Okay? And then the third type are the natural killer cells, or the NK cells. And again, they do similar things to the tumor cells, or to the T cells, in that they'll be fighting off against infected body cells and tumor cells, but they're going to be able to do it on a larger scale and destroy and attack a wider variety of those cells. Okay. And so as we look through, as we look at white blood cells and how we can kind of see some diseases that are associated with white blood cells, one of those major ones is called leukemia. Okay? And so leukemia is a situation that is a cancer that happens inside the red bone marrow. Okay? And so what happens is you start to produce more white blood cells, okay, than you're supposed to. And because you're producing so much more white blood cells at an uncontrollable rate, and at an incredibly fast rate, it hinders your ability to produce red blood cells appropriately. Okay? And so you end up producing large amounts of white blood cells that don't work the way they're supposed to be working. And that also is taking away from the red blood cells that you're supposed to be actually producing here. Okay? And so as a result, the symptoms that people typically will experience when they're dealing with leukemia is fatigue, because again, they don't have as much red blood cells as they should. Okay? And so they're gonna have a harder time delivering oxygen to help them produce ATP. They have an intolerance to cold for exactly the same reason. Pale skin, because again, they're not producing as much red blood cells. And then recurrent infections, because the white blood cells they are producing are not working the way they're supposed to be. Okay? And so there's various types of leukemia, like acute leukemia, chronic, lymphoblastic, myelogenic. And so there's different, some of the different types of really severe leukemias that can affect individuals, like acute lymphoblastic leukemia that affects children, usually acute myelogenous leukemia that affects both children and adults, and so on and so forth. Okay? So in order to look at someone who is dealing with leukemia, you would look at a blood smear, and you can see you have all of these different types of white blood cells all over the place, and not as many red blood cells, okay, which looks very different from the blood smear that we saw at the beginning of this chapter, where you have lots of red blood cells and very few white blood cells scattered around. Okay. Here you've got a ton of white blood cells, but again, they're not acting the way that they're supposed to be. Okay. And so they're just taking up space and not doing a whole lot. Okay. And the last type of cell that we're going to be looking at here, the last type of formed element, are the platelets. Okay. And so platelets form from these larger types of cells called megakaryocytes. Okay. And so these megakaryocytes are going to grow, and they're going to grow and mature. And then once they reach a certain stage, they're eventually going to splinter and fragment into these smaller components. Okay. All those small components of those megakaryocytes, when it ruptured, are what we refer to as platelets or thrombocytes. And those are what's going to enter the circulation. Okay. Now, platelets are important because they're going to help reduce the amount of blood loss from a blood vessel that has been ruptured or damaged. Okay. So over here, we can see that we have a blood vessel that has been ruptured. It's been opened up. Okay. And so blood is going to be leaking out. Okay. So in order to kind of plug up that hole, what's going to happen is we're going to take some red blood cells. Okay. We're going to clump them all together. And as we clump them all together, we're going to add some platelets to them as well. And that is going to form what's called a platelet plug. Okay. To plug up that opening in that in that blood vessel. Okay. So it's going to actually physically pull the two ends together and form a plug. Okay. In addition to that, the platelets are also going to start forming some threads called fibrin. Okay. And that fibrin helps to hold everything together inside that clot, inside that plug, and eventually will form what's called a blood clot. Okay, and that blood clot will help to prevent blood from leaking out of that particular vessel. Okay. Okay. So that is the platelets. So people who are dealing with hemophilia have an inability to produce these platelets, or inability to produce these blood clots, usually because of some kind of defect in this pathway here. Okay. Sometimes it may be due to the clotting factors that are not available. Sometimes it might be due to not having enough thrombin or prothrombin, or not being able to produce fibrin. So any pathway or any aspect of the pathway that falls apart here can lead someone to having the condition called hemophilia, where they just continually bleed and they're not able to form any blood clots. Okay, so we need to be able to form these platelets in order to help us produce blood clots here. Okay, so that is the end of this chapter. So now we're going to go ahead and begin on chapter 13, where we're going to be dealing with the heart. Okay, and so chapter 13, like I said, deals with the heart. And so here we're going to be taking a look at the anatomical location of the heart and looking at how it's organized, how it's built. We're going to be looking at the walls of the heart. We're going to be looking at the internal and external anatomy of it, look at the valves, and we're going to be looking at the various aspects of this, the circulation. Okay. On Wednesday, what we're going to be taking a look at is how the heart is going to be able to beat using some electricity throughout the cycle, or throughout the contraction cycle, and look at the phases of the cardiac cycle as well. Starting with the heart, we're going to be looking at the heart and how it's going to be able to beat. Okay. So typically your heart rate should be about 50 to 70 beats per minute. Okay. 50 is usually on the low end, but usually about 60 to 70 beats per minute is at resting heart rate is your normal heart rate. Okay. Now throughout the day, a heart is going to be beating about 100,000 times a day, which is incredible because we're only really aware of a small fraction of those beats. Okay. And then over the course of a year, it's going to be beating about 35 million times a year. So it's going to have a very high workload in comparison to a lot of the other muscles in the body. Okay. So it's going to be constantly working. And as it pumps, as it contracts, it's going to be pumping blood through about 75,000 miles worth of blood vessels that are all kind of stuffed in our body. Okay. So it's a pretty incredible system here. And so the heart is going to be pumping about 5 liters of blood every minute. And if you remember from chapter 12, we have about 5 liters of blood running through our body. So every minute, your heart is constantly pumping through all of the blood in your body, in your entire circulation. So pretty incredible organ here. And so the study of the heart and any of the diseases that come along with the heart is what's called the study of cardiology. Okay. So when we take a look at the heart is going to be a pretty hollow organ, and it's going to be mostly cone-shaped. And if you take your fist, it's about the size of your fist. And it's going to be locked right inside your mediastinum, okay, in between your two lungs. Okay. About 2/3 of your heart's mass is going to lie on the left side, which is why when you're looking for your heart rate, it's a lot easier to feel your heartbeat on the left side of your heart versus if you try to feel it on the right side, okay, of your chest. Okay. So the left side of your chest, you're going to be able to feel that heartbeat because the majority of the mass of your heart is going to be on the left side. Okay. There's going to be a couple regions here. And so the first area that we're going to be taking a look at is the apex of the heart. And so the apex is going to be this pointed area that's going to sit right on top of the diaphragm. Okay? And that is going to be formed by the left ventricle of the heart. So it's going to be more on the anterior side, it's going to be on the inferior side and oriented to the left of your heart. Okay? The base is going to be the opposite side. So that's going to be the more broad, wide portion here on the posterior aspect of the heart. And that is going to be formed by the atria. Okay. Now, to kind of orient ourselves with the heart, there's going to be 4 main surfaces we're going to be looking at. The first surface is the anterior surface, which is just deep to the sternum and the ribs. Okay. There's going to be an inferior surface, which runs from the apex to the right surface. Okay. The right surface is going to be facing the right lung, and it's going to extend all the way up to the base. And the left surface is going to extend from the base all the way down to the apex and will be facing the left lung. And so if we were to take a look at this heart within a cadaver, we're going to see that the heart is going to be locked right in between our lungs over here. Okay? And that's going to be important kind of going forward here. And again, just a picture here to see that the majority of the heart is going to lie on the left side of your midline, okay? On the left side of your chest. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the walls of the heart. And so we're going to kind of start from the outside and work our way in. Okay? The outermost portion of the heart is called the pericardium. And the pericardium is going to be a membrane that's going to sit on the outside of the heart, and it's going to be there mostly for protection. Okay? It's also going to hold the heart in its place and then allow it to be able to move and have nice, efficient freedom of movement while the heart is contracting. Now, just deep to the pericardium is a region called the epicardium. So, and before we get to the epicardium, one thing that I want to kind of bring up here to kind of help us recap back to chapter 1 and chapter 3 is that the pericardium is essentially a serous membrane. So it's going to have two layers. It's going to be a parietal layer and then a visceral layer. Okay? The visceral layer is the part that always will sit around that organ. Okay? So the visceral layer of the pericardium is what we refer to as the epicardium, okay? The part that actually lines the heart itself. Okay, so the epicardium is going to be made up of fibroelastic tissue as well as some adipose tissue, and the majority of that adipose tissue is going to be found inside, or is going to be found near the coronary vessels and the cardiac vessels of the heart. Okay, now the epicardium is going to give a bit of a slippery surface to the heart, so again to allow some nice easy freedom of movement. And inside the epicardium, we're going to have lots of blood vessels, lots of lymphatic vessels, and lots of nerves that are going to be extending into the myocardium. The next layer is the myocardium, and so that's going to be the next layer deep to the epicardium here, and that is going to be made up of muscle, specifically cardiac muscle. Okay. So this is the region of the heart that's responsible for pumping, that's responsible for allowing the heart to contract and relax. Okay. So this is the guy that's actually doing the work that our heart needs to be able to do. Okay. And so when we look at cardiac muscle, like we've seen already, cardiac muscle is going to have these very dark lines, okay, within it. And so these dark lines are called intercalated discs. And in these intercalated discs, we're going to find lots of desmosomes and lots of gap junctions. Okay. The desmosomes are going to be there to kind of hold all of the cardiac muscle fibers together. And the gap junctions are going to allow different ions to pass through in order to help kind of signaling processes within the heart, okay, and allow the heart to be able to contract in a coordinated manner. Okay. The next thing that's going to be important about cardiac muscle is that cardiac muscle is going to be very branched, okay, as opposed to skeletal muscle, which is more straight. Okay, cardiac muscle is going to be more branched, and so they're going to be kind of joining with one another here. Okay. And the cardiac muscle fibers are going to be a lot larger and more numerous than any of these skeletal muscles are. Okay. The last region of the heart is the endocardium. Okay. So the endocardium is a very smooth lining that makes up the chambers of the heart. Okay. It's going to be made up of mostly endothelium. Okay. This endothelium is also going to be connected and continuous with the endothelium of the blood vessels, those major blood vessels coming off the heart, specifically the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay. So those are the four layers of the heart. We've got the pericardium on the outside, kind of holding everything in place. On the inside, we have the epicardium. And deep to that, we have the myocardium, which causes contractions. And then on the inside portion, inside the chambers, we'll have the endocardium. Okay. And so the endocardium is going to be continuous with the endocardium, or sorry, with the endothelium of the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so question here. So which of the following is false regarding the location of the heart? So we have A, the heart is located within the mediastinum. B, the apex of the heart rests on the diaphragm. C, the heart is located between the sternum and the vertebral column. D, about 2/3 of the heart's mass lies to the left of the body's midline. Or E, the base of the heart rests on the diaphragm. Okay. So we're going to take a minute. So the answer you should get is E. So the base of the heart rests on the diaphragm. That is false. Okay, remember, the apex of the heart is going to rest on the diaphragm, whereas the base is going to be the more superior portion. Okay. So now we're going to take a look at looking at the sets of chambers of the heart. Okay, so again, we have a total of 4 chambers of the heart. The 2 superior chambers are the atria. So we have a left atrium over here, and then we have a right atrium on this side. Okay. So the roles of the atria are to receive blood from those major those major veins. Okay? And we'll look at what those veins are in a second. Okay? The two inferior chambers are the ventricles. Okay? So we're going to have a left ventricle over here, and then we're going to have a right ventricle on this side. Okay? So the roles of the ventricles are to be able to push blood and eject blood out of the heart and into those major arteries, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay? Now, if we close up the heart and look at the outer surface, we're going to see these two structures that almost look like dog ears sitting on the surface of the atria. And so these are called the auricles. So this is one auricle over here, and here's another auricle. Okay? The auricles almost act like little pouches. And so what they do is they're going to increase the volume of the atria just a little bit so that they're able to accommodate some more blood. Okay? Just a little bit more blood than normal. Okay? All right, so we got the atria, the ventricles, and then the auricles from there. Now, when we look at the heart, there's going to be two pumps that are going to be found within the heart. The first pump is going to be referred to as the pulmonary pump. The pulmonary pump is made up of the right atrium and the right ventricle. Okay? And so this pump is going to be responsible for pumping blood out of the heart and then into the lungs, into the blood vessels of the lungs. Okay? So that blood that's going to be getting pumped out of the right side of the heart is going to be deoxygenated. Okay? And so when we pump that deoxygenated blood out of the heart, it's eventually going to reach the lungs. Okay? The lungs are then going to oxygenate that blood. Okay? So the role of the pulmonary pump is to pump blood out of the heart and into the lungs to be oxygenated. Okay? And so this pump is a little bit weaker than the next pump, which is called the systemic pump, okay? Or considerably weaker, I should say. So the systemic pump is going to be made up of the left atrium and the left ventricle. Okay? And so those two components are responsible for pumping blood all the way throughout the rest of the body, all the way to your body systems. Okay? So we're going to be moving oxygenated blood from the left atrium to the left ventricle, out to the aorta, and to the rest of your body systems. Okay? Which is why it gets its name, the systemic pump, okay? Pumping blood to all of your systems. Okay? So when we take a look at the heart is going to have some sulci, which are these grooves that lie within the heart. Okay? Or a sulcus would be an individual groove. Okay? Each of those sulci are going to have some coronary blood vessels within them and some fat. Okay? The first one is called the coronary sulcus. And so the coronary sulcus is going to lie on the posterior aspect of the heart and kind of wrap around the heart itself. And that's going to form the boundary between the atria above and the ventricles below. Okay. The next one is the anterior interventricular sulcus. And so the anterior interventricular sulcus is going to be a groove that sits on the anterior aspect of the heart, and it's going to lie in between the left ventricles and the right ventricle. Okay, and so that's why it gets its name, the interventricular, inter meaning between, and then between the ventricles. So this is going to be on the anterior side. So it's going to be separating the left and right ventricles on the anterior side. Okay. On the posterior aspect of the heart, which we're looking at from this view over here, okay, we're going to find the posterior interventricular sulcus. Okay. And so again, that's going to sit on the posterior aspect of the heart, and it's going to lie in between the left and the right ventricles. Okay. Just like the anterior interventricular sulcus, just on the posterior side. Okay. So this is a picture of what our heart would look like in a cadaver. Okay, so we're able to see the coronary sulcus over here. And again, that would wrap all the way around the heart. Okay. And then here we have the anterior interventricular sulcus, which is going to divide or sit in between the left ventricle and the right ventricle. Okay. So now we're going to take a look at some of these chambers in more detail here. So the first chamber we're going to look at is the right atrium. Okay. The right atrium is going to receive deoxygenated blood. Okay. And it's going to receive that deoxygenated blood from three veins. Okay. The first vein that it's going to receive deoxygenated blood from is going to be the superior vena cava. Then it's also going to receive blood from the inferior vena cava. And then the third vein is going to be the coronary sinus, which is that vessel that sits inside the coronary sulcus. Okay. All three of those veins are going to drop off that blood into a hole in the right atrium, okay, right over here. Okay. In between the right atrium and the left atrium, there's going to be a very, very thin wall that separates the two called the interatrial septum. Okay. Now, in order for blood to move from the right atrium into the right ventricle, it has to pass through a valve called the tricuspid valve. Okay. So the tricuspid valve is going to be on the right side, okay, in between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Okay. Then we get into the right ventricle here. And so the right ventricle is going to be making up the majority of the anterior surface of the heart. Okay. The first structures that we're going to see here are called the chordae tendineae, which are found in both ventricles. So here we have the chordae tendineae, which are these tendon-like cords. And so they're going to be anchoring from that valve, in this case, the tricuspid valve, okay, anchoring from that valve into the papillary muscles, okay, which are these muscles that look like almost like the nipples on a baby's bottle. Okay, so these are the papillary muscles, and they're going to be attached to the chordae tendineae. Okay, and so these guys are going to be important, the chordae tendineae. So we'll come back to those in a second. Okay. Okay. In between the two ventricles, we're going to have another wall, a thicker wall, called the interventricular septum. Okay, and so that is going to separate the left atrium, sorry, the left ventricle from the right ventricle over here. Okay. The next valve that we're going to see is the pulmonary valve. So when the right ventricle contracts, it's going to be pumping blood up into the pulmonary trunk. Okay, in order to get into the pulmonary trunk, we have to pass that blood through the pulmonary valve. Okay. From there, that pulmonary, once the blood passes through the pulmonary valve, it's going to enter a very large blood vessel called the pulmonary trunk over here. Okay. And this pulmonary trunk will eventually split into the left pulmonary artery and then the right pulmonary artery, which is behind the aorta over here. Okay. And so those pulmonary arteries are going to transfer that blood over to the lungs. Okay. And so this is a pulmonary trunk right here. Okay. Then we move into the left atrium. Okay. So once that blood gets oxygenated, okay, it's going to come back to the lungs, or sorry, it's going to come back to the heart through 4 pulmonary veins. Okay, 2 pulmonary veins coming from the left side of the lungs, or from the left lung, 2 pulmonary veins coming from the right lung. Okay, and they're going to drop off right into the left atrium here. Okay. So the left atrium is going to form the majority of the base of the heart. Okay. For that blood to move from the left atrium into the left ventricle, it has to pass through another valve called the bicuspid valve, or also called the mitral valve. Okay. So blood has to move from the left atrium into, or past the bicuspid valve and into the left ventricle. Okay. Now that we're in the left ventricle, okay, the left ventricle is going to be the thickest part of the heart, and that's going to form the apex. And again, it's going to have the chordae tendineae, which are going to anchor the bicuspid valve to the papillary muscles. Okay. And so when the left ventricle contracts, it's going to be pumping blood from the left ventricle through the aortic valve, okay, and then into the ascending aorta, okay, which is the largest blood vessel, or the largest artery inside the body. Okay. Oops. Sorry, let me backtrack here. So some of that blood, when it enters the ascending aorta, will be deposited into the coronary arteries, which are going to supply the heart itself. And then the rest of it will pass into the aortic arch and into the descending aorta, and eventually to the rest of your body systems from there. Okay, so those are the 4 chambers: the right atrium, left ventricle, left ventricle. Okay. And there's going to be a total of 4 valves: the tricuspid valve, the bicuspid valve, the pulmonary valve, and the aortic valve. Okay, so now we're looking at the heart. We've gone through all 4 of those chambers. We've looked at the valves here. One thing I want us to bring our attention to is the differences in the thickness of the myocardium in different regions of the heart. Okay. So if we look at the atria and we look at the ventricles, take a few minutes, pause the video, and see what kind of things you're able to notice about the myocardium in different regions of the heart. Okay. So you should have been able to notice that the myocardium is going to be different thicknesses in different areas. Okay. So if we look at the atria's myocardium is going to be very, very, very thin compared to the thickness of the myocardium in the ventricles. Okay. That's going to be for a specific reason, and we'll look at that reason in a second here. Okay. The second thing that we're going to notice is that the left ventricle has a much thicker myocardium than the right ventricle does. Okay. So that being said, think about why that would be the case. Why would the left ventricle have a thicker myocardium than the right ventricle does. Okay. The reason for that is because the left ventricle has a much higher workload. Okay. It needs to be able to pump blood all the way throughout the body systems. Okay. So it has to have and has to still find a way to get that blood all the way back up to the heart. Okay. When we're looking at the right ventricle, it just needs to produce enough energy to pump blood to the lungs and then back to the heart. So it's not covering as much of a distance, so not as much myocardium is needed. Okay. Because the left ventricle needs to pump blood all the way throughout the body and then back up to the heart, it needs a lot more myocardium in order to make sure that that's able to happen. Okay. All right, so this slide just kind of illustrates exactly what I just said here. So the thickness, like I said, is going to vary in different chambers of the heart. Okay, the atria are going to have a very, very thin myocardium because they only need to deliver blood from the atria into the ventricles. Okay, they only need to deliver that blood over a very short distance. They don't need very much myocardium. Okay, there's not a whole lot of pressure needed, so there's not a whole lot of myocardium necessary. Okay, the ventricles, on the other hand, have a much higher workload because they have to deliver that blood over a larger distance. Okay, the right ventricle needs to pump that blood back to the lungs and then back into the heart, whereas the left ventricle needs to pump that blood all the way throughout the body and then back to the heart. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the valves of the heart. Okay, so like we mentioned, we have 4 valves. Okay? And so these valves are going to be important because they're going to be preventing backflow of blood, okay, into a specific chamber. They're basically going to be preventing blood from flowing backwards, okay, which we don't want to have happen. Okay? So we have 2 sets of valves. Okay, the first ones are called the atrioventricular valves. Okay, these are the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves. Okay. Then we have the semilunar valves, which are the pulmonary valve and then the aortic valve. Okay. So we're going to look at how these guys are going to work. The first valves we're going to be taking a look at are the atrioventricular valves, and as you can probably tell by the name, they're going to be situated in between the atria and the ventricles. Okay, so these are going to be our tricuspid valve on the right side of the heart, in between our right atria and the right ventricles. Okay, and the bicuspid valve in between the left atrium and the left ventricles. Okay. So the way these valves are going to be opening and closing is going to be determined by the amount of fluid pressure inside the heart, okay, in different chambers of the heart. Okay. So what's going to happen is we're going to have our atria contracting, right? So when the atria contracts, the pressure inside the atria is going to start to build up as it starts to contract further and further and further. Okay. When the interatrial pressure, when the pressure inside the atria exceeds that of the ventricular pressure, that's going to push those valves to open up. Okay, it's almost like if you and your sibling are trying to push both sides of a door. Okay, once you're able to exert more pressure or more force than your sibling is able to, that door is going to fly open. Same thing is happening here. Okay, when the atria produces more pressure than the pressure inside the ventricles, these valves, the atrioventricular valves, are going to fly open, okay, and allow blood to come from the atria into the ventricles. Okay, and the AV valve is going to be pushed open. Now, in order to close those valves, the ventricles are going to start to contract. Okay? And so when the ventricles contract, again, the pressure inside the ventricles is going to start to push the blood backwards a little bit. Okay? And when it pushes that blood backwards, that's going to cause the, when the ventricular pressure is higher than that of the atrial pressure, that's going to cause blood to flow backwards. And when that blood flows backwards, it's going to actually close up these cusps of these bicuspid and tricuspid valves, okay? And that will effectively close those particular valves and prevent blood from flowing backwards, okay? So that is a way to help make sure that blood does not flow backwards into the atria. Okay, so that's that. The next thing that's going to be important is the chordae tendineae, okay? Now the chordae tendineae need to be in good health because if they're damaged, then they're not going to be able to allow these cusps of our tricuspid and bicuspid valves to close properly. Okay? So if they're damaged, these cusps don't close properly, and then you end up having blood regurgitating back into the atria whenever the ventricles contract. Okay? And so as a result, the ventricles are still going to be exerting the same amount of pressure, but they're not going to be ejecting the same amount of blood as they should be. Okay? They're going to be ejecting a lot less blood than what should be getting ejected out. And as a result, you end up having less blood flow and less oxygen getting delivered throughout the body. Okay. So we want our chordae tendineae to be in good health and not damaged. So again here, in order to allow the atria and the ventricles to allow blood flow, okay, between the two, we need, we're going to be looking at fluid pressure within the chambers of the heart. Okay. So the next valves are the semilunar valves. Okay. So the semilunar valves are our pulmonary valves and our aortic valves. Okay. These guys are going to allow blood to eject out of the ventricles, and they're also going to prevent blood from flowing backwards into the heart, specifically into the left and right ventricles. Okay. And again, this is going to be due to fluid pressure inside those chambers. Okay. So when the ventricles contract, the pressure inside the ventricles is eventually going to exceed the pressure inside those major arteries, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay. When that happens, okay, when that ventricular pressure increases past that point, that is going to push the semilunar valves open and allow blood to eject into the pulmonary trunk and into the aorta. Okay, exactly the same way as we saw with the bicuspid and tricuspid valves. Okay, so that's that. So that's going to allow them to pump into those major arteries. Okay, now when those ventricles begin to relax, okay, some of that blood flow inside the arteries is going to start to flow backwards. Okay, and when it flows backwards, it's going to close up the cusps of your semilunar valves. Okay, when that closes up, blood is not going to be able to get back into the ventricles, and then you're going to end up just ejecting that blood further into the vasculature. Okay? So this is a way that you're going to prevent backflow of blood into the ventricles. Okay? And so that is going to be due to reduced pressure inside the ventricles when the ventricles are relaxing. Okay? So again, this is all going to be due to fluid pressure inside the lungs, sorry, inside the heart. Okay, so question here. So which of the following contains the wall with the thickest myocardium? Left atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle, or both the right and left ventricles? Okay. So you should be getting the left ventricle. Okay, next question is, so which of the following causes heart valves to open? We have A, changes in fluid pressure within the chambers of the heart, B, contraction of the papillary muscles, C, contraction of the fibrous skeleton, D, relaxation of the ascending aorta, or E, relaxation of the papillary muscles. Just take a minute. So your answer should be A. So changes in the fluid pressure within those chambers of the heart is going to allow those valves to open. Okay, now we have our next question. So in the figure shown, which valve is indicated? Is this the bicuspid valve, the tricuspid valve, the aortic valve, the pulmonary valve, or the mitral valve? And we're looking in between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So take a minute there. So this one would be the tricuspid valve. Okay. So the way you can kind of remember that is the tricuspid valve is going to be on the right side. Okay. So tri and right kind of sound similar. Tricuspid valve will be on the right side, whereas the bicuspid valve will be on the left side. Okay, so next question. So which valve prevents backflow into the right ventricle? Okay. The bicuspid valve, tricuspid valve, aortic valve, pulmonary valve, or the mitral valve? So preventing backflow of blood into the right ventricle would be the pulmonary valve. Okay. So this is a question that is going to be common, and the one thing that you need to be comfortable with for the homework and for the exam. Okay, you want to be comfortable with which valves are going to be preventing backflow into which compartments of the heart. Okay. Cool. Okay. So now we're going to be taking a look at the circulation, and this is going to be another topic that's going to be very important, and this is going to be one that you will for sure see on the exam as a free response question. So you need to be comfortable with the circulation of the heart. Okay. So we're going to kind of walk through this kind of piece by piece here. So we're going to start with the pulmonary circulation. And so with the pulmonary circulation, we're going to start in the right atrium. Okay. So the right atrium is going to receive deoxygenated blood. Okay. So deoxygenated blood is going to be coming from the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. Okay. So all three of those vessels are going to drop off deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Okay. When they deliver that blood into the right atrium, okay, the atria is going to contract, and as it contracts, it's going to be pushing that blood through the tricuspid valve and then into the right ventricle. Okay. From there, the right ventricle will contract, and that's going to eject blood from the heart, or from the right ventricle into the pulmonary valve, and then from the pulmonary valve through into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk will then branch into the pulmonary arteries, which will eventually reach the pulmonary capillaries inside the lungs. Okay. Once they reach the pulmonary capillaries, our blood is now going to be able to deposit that carbon dioxide into the lungs that we can then breathe out. And at the same time, it's going to be picking up an oxygen that we just breathed in and deposit that into the blood from there. Okay. That oxygen, or the oxygenated blood now, and now we have oxygenated blood, is going to then exit out of the lungs through the pulmonary veins. And as it enters the pulmonary veins, it's then going to get delivered into the left atrium here. Okay, that's our pulmonary circulation. And that brings us into our systemic circulation. So for our systemic circulation, again, we're going to be starting with our oxygenated blood inside our left atrium. Okay, this oxygenated blood that had just come from the lungs. Okay, and so this left atrium is going to be depositing that blood through the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve, into the left ventricle. Okay. From there, the left ventricle is then going to contract, and when it contracts, it's going to push that blood through the aortic valve and then into the aorta. Okay. And then from there, the aorta will then branch into all these different types of arteries, okay, and all the systemic arteries throughout the body. Okay. And we're going to be able to deliver oxygenated blood to all the different systems in the body, all over, with the exception of the blood vessels around the air sacs of the lung, which we'll talk about next week. Okay. So once they deliver that oxygen to various systems, that blood will then be picking up on carbon dioxide, and so now it's going to be deoxygenated blood. Okay. And then that blood will then return back to the heart through a series of veins, systemic veins, and then get deposited into the right atrium from there. Okay. So, like I said, this is going to be the circulation that you need to be comfortable with for the exam. Okay, so kind of walk through this one more time. We're going to start with the right atrium. So the right atrium is going to be taking in lots of deoxygenated blood. It's going to be moving that blood through the tricuspid valve and into the right ventricle. From there, the right ventricle will contract and push that blood through the pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries from there. Okay. The pulmonary arteries will then branch into the pulmonary capillaries inside the lung. It's going to deposit that carbon dioxide and then pick up oxygen. And so now we have oxygenated blood. Okay. That oxygenated blood will then exit out of the lungs through the pulmonary veins and return to the left atrium of the heart. Okay. From there, that blood is going to move from the left atrium through the bicuspid valve and into the left ventricle. Okay. From the left ventricle, that blood is going to move through the aortic valve into the aorta and into a series of arteries, okay, throughout your body systems. We're going to be depositing oxygen to those systems or to those organs, picking up on carbon dioxide, and now we have a series of veins which now have deoxygenated blood. Okay. So that deoxygenated blood will then return back to the heart through the right atrium via the coronary sinus, the superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava. Okay. So like I said, be comfortable with this circulation and with this pathway, because again, this will show up on the exam. Okay, so this is just a kind of a schematic here that kind of helps to show you where the blood is going to be flowing from moment to moment. Okay. There's the third type of circulation, which is called the coronary circulation. So the coronary circulation is going to be the circulation that actually supplies the muscle of the heart, the myocardium. Okay. So just like any other organ, the heart needs to have its own blood supply. Now that blood supply is going to be coming in the form of the coronary circulation. The reason for the coronary circulation is that the blood inside the chambers of the heart cannot just transmit oxygen from the chambers of the heart directly into the myocardium. It's too thick of tissue. Okay? The oxygen is not going to be able to pass through, and nutrients, waste, things like that. They're not going to be able to pass directly from the chamber into the myocardium. Okay, so they need a pathway directly into the coronary circulation. So what's going to be taking place here? Let me find my. Okay. So, oops. What did I do? Okay. So we're going to have our coronary circulation here. And so our coronary vessels are going to be branching off of the ascending aorta. Okay? And so when they branch off of the ascending aorta, they're going to branch off into the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. And those arteries are going to pierce into the myocardium to be able to deliver oxygen and nutrients effectively. Okay? So most of the oxygenated blood is going to be delivered whenever the heart is relaxing, just because of the aortic pressure being higher than the ventricular pressure at that point. Okay. So here we're going to see our left coronary artery. So we got, like I said, two coronary arteries. The left one is going to pass underneath the kind of inferior to the left auricle. Okay. And then it's going to divide into the anterior interventricular branch, okay, which is going to sit inside the anterior interventricular sulcus over here. Okay. And so that's going to deliver oxygen and supply oxygenated blood to both walls of the ventricles, okay, both the left and the right ventricles. Okay. The second component of the left coronary artery, the second branch, is called the circumflex branch. And so that is going to sit inside the coronary sulcus, and that is going to be able to deliver oxygenated blood to the left atrium and the left ventricle. Okay. So those are the two branches of the left coronary artery. Okay. For the right coronary artery, again, that's going to pass inferior to the right auricle, and then it's going to divide into the posterior interventricular branch, which is on the posterior side of the heart, inside the posterior interventricular sulcus. And just like the anterior interventricular branch, it's going to be delivering oxygenated blood to both walls of the ventricles. Okay. The second branch is called the marginal branch, which runs along the right side of the right surface of the heart. And then it's going to deliver that blood specifically to the right ventricle of the heart. Okay. The last thing that we're going to be seeing inside the coronary circulation is a series of anastomoses. Okay. So you can kind of think of these anastomoses almost like little detours. So if there's a region where one of the, or a situation where one of the coronary blood vessels gets blocked, okay, that would create a bit of a problem. But because we have these anastomoses, we're going to have these little detours coming off of our coronary arteries that are still able to supply that same region, but just going through a different pathway. Okay. So they're going to provide an alternate route to deliver oxygenated blood to a specific aspect of the myocardium if the main route is obstructed by a blood clot or something like that. Okay. So anastomoses are really, really important here. Okay. In addition to having all of these coronary arteries, you're also going to have a series of coronary veins. Okay. For the sake of our class, we're not going to worry too much about the coronary veins, but just know that they're there to help drain deoxygenated blood from those aspects of the myocardium. Okay. So we're going to have the great cardiac vein, we're going to have the middle cardiac vein, the small cardiac vein, and then the anterior cardiac vein. It's all working together. And again, don't worry about the specifics for that. Just know that they're there. Okay. All right. So that leads us to our last section for today, which is called the clinical connection regarding myocardial ischemia and myocardial infarction. Okay. And this is the one of the clinical connections I do want you to be familiar with for the exam. Okay. So a myocardial ischemia happens whenever there's some blood flow that is partially obstructed. Okay, it's not completely obstructed, but it's partially obstructed. And so you end up with reduced blood flow within one of the coronary arteries. And as a result, you end up with reduced blood flow to a specific area of the myocardium. Okay? And so this can lead to tissue hypoxia, which causes some of the cells to be a little bit weaker and not be as strong as they should be. Okay? And so if I were to kind of draw this out, what a myocardial ischemia would look like, let's say this might be one of our blood vessels over here. And then you might have some plaque buildup, kind of like this. So here's our plaque. Okay. And so as a result of this plaque buildup, now you have reduced blood flow to this specific region instead of having nice, easy blood flow. Okay. And so as a result of having reduced blood flow, you end up delivering less oxygen to those areas of the heart that need it. Okay. And so one of the symptoms of myocardial ischemia is what's called angina pectoris, which is a very severe pain that happens inside the chest, which will usually accompany myocardial ischemia. Okay. Now again, this happens if blood flow is partially blocked to a part of the myocardium, okay, or in the coronary vessels. This opposite, or if this develops further, if you end up developing more obstructions inside your coronary vessels, you can end up with what's called a myocardial infarction, where you have a complete obstruction of that coronary vessel. Okay. If there's complete obstruction to that coronary vessel, there's not going to be any blood flow distal to wherever that obstruction is. Okay. And because there's no blood flow, that's going to be leading to no oxygen getting to those aspects of the myocardium. And if there's no oxygen, then those parts of the myocardium are going to end up dying. And so that causes tissue death inside the heart, which is a very, very dangerous situation. And so myocardial infarction, it's a more classical name, or the name that we're more comfortable and more familiar with, is a heart attack. And so this is what happens whenever someone develops a heart attack. There's an obstruction in one of those coronary vessels, or multiple of those coronary vessels, which causes an obstruction of oxygen to those particular regions of the tissue. Okay. And so this can cause the heart to stop contracting altogether because it's developed scar tissue instead of being more muscular. And this can be a pretty dangerous situation. Okay. So when the cardiac tissue dies here, you end up developing scar tissue that does not contract nearly as well. Okay. So in order to, or I guess one of the major symptoms of myocardial infarction or a heart attack is usually people will feel a lot of pain in their chest as well as going into their arms. Okay. So people will feel like a crushing chest pain. They'll often say that it feels like an elephant is sitting on their chest. So that's that crushing chest pain that people are talking about. You feel intense pain going down into the arms, like we see with this fellow over here. Okay. And so those are the two major aspects of symptoms that you're going to be able to feel. And the third symptom is going to be shortness of breath. Okay. So in order to treat this, what we're going to be working with is what's called a stent. Okay. And so in a stent here, what we're going to do is, let me kind of clear this out here. What a cardiologist will do is they will find the area that has the plaque buildup. Okay. They'll insert a balloon catheter into that particular vessel, okay, and that balloon catheter will eventually expand. And when it expands, it actually breaks up the blood clots, breaks up the plaque, and then allows blood flow to now be nice and easy as it should be. Okay. So once that balloon catheter expands, you break up those clots, and then you leave the stent in there, which almost looks like a chain link fence. Okay. And that stent helps to keep that blood vessel open and also prevents any plaque from continuing to build up in that particular vessel. Okay. And you're able to just leave the stent in there for long periods of time, and everything is just fine in that particular coronary artery. Okay. So last question here. So like I said, this is one thing that I do want you to be comfortable with for the exam: myocardial ischemia and myocardial infarction. Okay. So last question here. Which of the following transports oxygenated blood? This is the pulmonary trunk, the superior vena cava, the right ventricle, the pulmonary veins, or the pulmonary arteries. So the answer to this one is the pulmonary veins. Yeah. So these ones will carry oxygenated blood from the lungs directly back to the heart. So if you remember, veins will always be carrying blood back to the heart. In this case, the pulmonary veins will be taking oxygenated blood from the lungs and directing it to the heart. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. On Wednesday, we're going to pick up with the cardiac conduction system and look at how the heart is actually able to beat. Okay. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.